So welcome back to another episode of Explain Yourself. This time I'm at the Midwestern Ecology and Evolution Conference in Indiana, and I'm here with Kristen Manion, who's a master's student at Northwestern University in a joint program with the Chicago Botanic Garden. So thanks so much for agreeing to speak with us and explain yourself.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So I know you literally just did this in your talk session, but we always like to start off by having people tell us about your current research.
Yeah, okay. So I study what are called solitary ground nesting bees, and I study solitary ground nesting bees in the tallgrass prairie. So I'll kind of like break down what all of those things mean a little bit. So the tallgrass prairie is one of the most anthropogenically disturbed habitats in the world, and less than 0.1% of the original habitat remains in the Midwestern U.S. And so I'm really interested in ways in which we can protect and conserve this native habitat. And in this ecosystem, the tallgrass prairie, bees are the most important and abundant pollinators of the prairie plants in this ecosystem. And so the majority of the bees in the tallgrass prairie build their nests in the soil or in the ground, and we call them ground nesting bees. And so you probably know a little bit about honeybees, and honeybees are actually managed bees that are used in agriculture, and so they're not native to North America. And you might know a little bit about bumblebees, and bumblebees are native species to North America, but they behave in a eusocial way, so they have like a social hierarchy and live in a colony. But the bees that I work on are solitary bees, and so they build nests and provision resources independently of one another. So one mama bee goes out and forages for pollen on her own and rears young by herself.
So when you say eusocial, that's the fancy science word for truly social, right? So like honeybees and bumblebees have like the bee hive structure that most of us may have heard of with like a queen and then like the workers.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Okay. But the solitary bees, like they don't make like a hive and they work entirely alone, or do they have like help from one another sometimes?
Yeah, so there is some evidence of some sociality in ground nesting bees, but not in the way that we would call it like traditionally the same way as honeybees and bumblebees. So ground nesting bees can sometimes nest in what we call aggregations. So they'll build nests near each other, but they act independently of one another.
Okay.
So they build nests and provision their resources alone, even though sometimes they'll all live together. And what does that mean? Maybe it has more to do with the habitat that's suitable for where they're building their nests.
So it's more like a bee apartment complex than it is like an actual like family group working together.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said you're interested in like how they choose where they build their nests?
Yeah, so I'm interested in learning the kinds of microhabitats that could be driving where they decide to build their nests or not. And so we have a lot of evidence, mostly in the southwestern United States, on ground nesting bees in that area, about the kinds of things that they might like for their habitat. So from the southwest, we know that they like sandy soils. They also like what's called bare ground, which is ground free of vegetation and litter. So a lot of that has to do with, like, we think light or illumination cues. And we also know that they like, certain slopes, so south-facing slopes, well-drained soils that are easy to dig into so that they can build their nests, and that they pick up on some vegetation cues, but we're not totally sure, and a lot of that has to do with bees that have like special relationships with some plant species. But as far as the ground nesting bees in the tallgrass prairie, we have virtually little knowledge of where we think they're building their nests. And the habitat in the prairie is so much different than in the desert southwest. So it's important for us to ask these questions and kind of learn more about where they're living and provisioning nests.
Yeah. So like the insects that I work with definitely have what we would call fossorial legs, or legs that are good at digging into the ground. So do solitary ground nesting bees also have like adaptations to their legs that make them better at digging?
Yeah, so many bees also have a part on their abdomen as well that they can help, they use as a plate to help dig in. It's like a scooper sort of, or a shovel. Awesome. It's really fascinating, yeah. But many ground nesting bees have exactly what you just talked about. That makes it easier for them to dig into the soil. And then some ground nesting bees also have this special plate that lets them like dig like a shovel. So it's kind of cool and exciting, yeah.
Oh, wow. And what does their nest look like? Like, is it just a hole, or did they build something?
Yeah, so some bee nests can be up to 7 feet into the ground. I would probably say that that's like an extreme, but for the
they're
most,
so tiny.
I know, they are tiny, yeah, but often, so sometimes nests will be reused by the next generation of bees, and so sometimes bees will like dig deeper and deeper and deeper to build, kind of have their own little like chambers where they can lay eggs. But most bee nests are somewhere between like 6 inches to a foot into the soil, and they're kind of like, they're little tunnels. They're little tunnels in the soil, and then they have these chambers where they go and they lay one egg in one chamber, and so that's kind of, it's hard to explain exactly what the nest like looks like, but
wow. Okay, so they are very extensive tunnelers.
Yes.
That is really cool.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah. Interesting.
So how did you get into this? It's interesting and exciting to say that like, oh, nobody has asked this question yet. So like, how did you wind up being the person asking this question?
Yeah. So I was really interested in doing work in the tallgrass prairie, especially because like I'm from the Midwest, and it's this like really threatened ecosystem, and it like for me, you know, is like such a part of my life, like, you know, mentally, spiritually, and it's just like an interesting place to like ask questions into. But I have always kind of like had this fascination with bees, and especially when I was in college several years ago, there was a lot of like buzz in the media about, you know, bee declines. Yep. A lot of it centered around like honeybees, for instance, but I was really interested in learning about native bees because they're very understudied, and ground nesting native bees, this nesting component of a bee's life cycle, is another thing that we know so little about. And so I was interested in looking at and asking questions about things that are really understudied, because the contribution of that to science is so great. Since we know so little, like the value of the contribution can really like move the field forward. Yeah. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, that was kind of the inspiration. And also I just like love bees and the prairie, and you know, what a great place to work, and great steady organism. Yeah.
We do have the best office.
Yeah. That's great.
So that's sort of a good segue into another question that we always like to have everybody answer. So how and why did you decide to become a scientist, or like what was your journey to becoming a scientist, and especially like why grad school?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when I entered university, and I went to the University of Kansas, also Rock Chalk, if anyone out there is an alum, and I was really interested in science, although I didn't have a very strong science background from high school, and I never really thought I had a very mathematical or scientific brain, but I wanted to challenge myself, and I was interested in like, I took a lot of like pre-med courses, and that kind of is what I was interested in at first when I entered undergrad, was a pre-med career, or you know, career in medicine. But I learned very quickly after I took my introductory ecology, evolutionary biology class, that I found like ecology to be so much more interesting, and also the applied conservation component of ecology as well. Because in my experience, like, you know, I have members of my family who have lived and grown up on farms and been farmers, and who often are making kind of these on-the-ground decisions, sometimes about conservation, or like, what's the best thing to do for our crops, or what's the best thing to do for our natural areas. And I was really interested in applied research. So I had some opportunities in undergrad to do field work, and I did an RAU at the Chicago Botanic Garden, where I'm now currently a grad student. And I was in a program for underrepresented groups in science when I was in college, and they kind of helped shepherd me into the master's program that I'm in now. So they provided me with a lot of resources, gave me advice, helped me understand kind of the system for applying, which can be really tricky and complicated and stressful. But I had a lot of help and resources, and I was very fortunate and thankful that I had that opportunity available to me.
That's awesome to have a community resource like that. Yeah, I think a lot of people sort of navigate the grad school thing without really like having much of an idea, unless they can talk to somebody.
Yeah, and mentorship is an important component to that as well. So if you have a great mentor too, you can get a lot of really valuable feedback and advice and guidance from good mentors.
Yeah. Tell us more about your REU, because I know those are a really awesome sort of, a gateway into doing more research-heavy careers and stuff for undergrads. And like, if you can do research in undergrad, that sets you up really well for your future in grad school.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was an undergrad, I was in a soil microbial ecology lab for a little while, but I kind of knew, I was learning the basics of ecology, but I knew that I was really interested in bees or like pollination of some kind. So what I wanted to do was get some other outside research opportunities doing that. And so I applied for an REU at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and my project was looking at a native plant species, Indian paintbrush, called Castanea sessiliflora. And I was mentored by one of the current PhD students in our program now. Her name is Katie Wenzel, and she works on Castanea. And the question was kind of about, is there a floral color variation based on geographic range of the plant species? Sure. So what we did was we collected like plant tissues and we went in the field. So I got to go to like Wyoming and Minnesota and great places across the West and sample. And then the majority of that project was actually work in the lab. And so we would extract DNA from plant tissues, and we got an idea kind of indirectly of how pollination might be impacting these plant species, but like I didn't do any like direct pollinator observations or research with that. But that was a great opportunity and gave me a lot of skills and gave me an idea and understanding of maybe why I would want to do grad school, go into a master's, and so that's why I applied to the Chicago Botanic Garden, but this time as a master's student. And with this opportunity for my master's, I was able to really, really decide on exactly the kind of project that I would want to do and kind of craft my own interests as well. So
That is one of the most fun and scary things about grad school, coming up with your own project. So I liked, you said something a little bit ago about how important mentorship is, and you just mentioned the PhD student that your REU was partnered with. So when you think about the mentors you've had, or if you were going to search for another mentor or like research advisor or whatever, like, what are the sort of characteristics that you think are super important in those people?
Okay, well, I would first say that like, for instance, diversity and inclusion and working towards making science a more safe and hospitable place is something that is very, very important to me personally. And I think you can really pick up on whether or not a PI cares about that by kind of asking questions during like your interview, if you're invited for an interview, or over the phone when you first meet them. And part of that is asking like, what is their mentorship style? So often they will kind of explain like, oh, well, I like to meet with students once a week, and here are the things that I expect from students. Or something else, maybe a more hands-off mentor might say, well, I only meet with you when you feel like you need help from me, but I expect you to do this, but I'm here for you when you need me. So it's kind of tricky to navigate too as well, because it's also kind of dependent on like where you might get an offer to go to grad school as well. But I would say a great way to find out about whether a mentor is going to be good or not is to talk with their current graduate students and kind of get an idea. You can kind of pick up on some red flags that way. So it's like, oh, so how often do you meet with your mentor? And someone might be like, well, I haven't met with them the entire semester or something. That to me would be a red flag. I think I require like weekly meetings, or at least like pretty frequent check-ins with my advisor, and it works really well for us. And also having like specific goals for our meetings too is something that has been helpful in moving along in the thesis process too. And
I like that you said that too, that you've become aware of the sort of mentor that you need, right? Because maybe somebody would be like, if you're a real self-starter go-getter, maybe you are okay with a hands-off person, but a lot of us do better with like deadlines and meeting with someone to sort of check in regularly.
Absolutely.
So it's about knowing what you want and then being good at asking the questions to figure out if they're a good fit.
And I think too, like, it can be really challenging to navigate a relationship where there is like a kind of a hierarchy. Your PI is your advisor, and he or she or they could have a lot of control and say in like your success. And so finding someone that it can be more of a partnership or a collaborator or a colleague type relationship rather than like this very strict.
They're not your boss.
They're not your boss. Yeah, and I feel very comfortable like with Stuart, my advisor, Stuart Wagenius at the Chicago Botanic Garden. I feel comfortable, like I can go to him with concerns that I have about my research, but also if there are concerns, other concerns, in my life or in the department, I feel like I can talk to him about those things, and that's really important to me. Yeah, and part of that is also overcoming some of your own like hesitations of like maybe you've only ever had a boss, and so it's hard like to approach like that relationship that way, but maybe you can find people in your lab, or maybe your advisor will just like help establish a relationship like that with you. Yeah,
that's awesome.
So, yeah.
And you sort of hinted at one of the other main themes I like to address here. So one of the important or valuable aspects of Explain Yourself is that like anybody who wants to can and should become a scientist, because this is an exciting and great place to work. But it's easier to feel like you can belong in this space if you can see and hear stories of other people who are like you. So representation and diversity is important. So what sort of experiences in your trajectory or your career as a scientist have you had that are maybe connected to any sort of diverse groups that you might belong in, and how would you want other people to be able to sort of learn from those experiences? And
So I will say, for instance, like my RAU opportunity was really great because in college I was a Pell Grant recipient, and I had to work a lot, so it was really hard for me to have the opportunity to volunteer in a research lab for free. And so through this undergraduate program I talked about, it's called IMSD, they would pay me to work in a research lab, and that, that makes so much of a difference, especially if you're like a financially insecure student. Having that opportunity to gain research experience that doesn't detrimentally impact you financially is one way for me. And and also I think too, I think I was a little bit of a victim of this idea that we teach young women growing up that maybe they're not very good at science or good at math. And I still often feel that way sometimes about my own abilities, right? And we call that imposter syndrome, and I'm sure you've talked about that a little bit. And so I never thought I had a very scientific mind or a very mathematical mind when I was young. And I think part of that was hammered in me by some of these like gendered expectations for women. But as I was entering, the research process and learning more about it, I realized that actually research involves so much more creativity than we give science, I think, credit for. And so asking questions and writing and coming up with these thoughts and new ideas was something to me that was really exciting and something that I never thought I'm not good at math, or I'm not good at science, I can't do that. But that's not true, actually. And I've been able to improve the skills that I thought that I weren't very good at, and I'm actually a lot better at them than I think I ever thought, right? And part of that, too, has been having this great community of female scientists at my current institution, and we're about 50-50 split for men, women, as far as faculty go, and we have more female grad students than male grad students. And part of that community is being able to come together and kind of talk about the challenges that women and underrepresented people face in science. So.
And let's be real, people talk about the math thing all the time. I had a huge problem with the math thing too, but in high school and early in college, they make you feel like if you're not good at calculus, you can't be a scientist. But how often have you used calculus in your research?
I don't think at all.
Yep,
actually. And if I do, I have a model or a program or something that I can use to maybe just do it for me.
Exactly. So I will always be happy when people bring up imposter syndrome, because it's something that many more of us experience than I think a lot of people realize, and it's not just something that you can sort of be like, oh well, I'll just wave it away, right? It's something that we have to sort of work with and work through. And you said that you felt when you were younger maybe this wasn't for you, but obviously you did wind up choosing science in college. So Was there a background like in your family or just like the way you spent your time as a younger kid that sort of made you feel like you wanted to try science?
Yeah, so I grew up in a military family, and so we moved all over the country, and that is like quite an unstable kind of childhood to have. By no one's fault, but it's just part of kind of like what military kids have to experience. And so I never lived anywhere for very long. But my grandparents have a farm like outside of the St. Louis area, and it's got this great like natural space. And I think for me it always kind of felt like this home that I was able to have, even though we were moving around a lot. We could always go to Nana and Papa's house and kind of like get this like outdoors and natural experience. And I think like at the time, I didn't realize how valuable that was for me as a kid, but I think as I kind of like got older, I recognized the value and like the role that nature plays in my life. And so learning about it in science, it was also so fascinating to like learn like the principles of ecology and like learn more about evolutionary biology. And I realized that like I've been thinking about those things ever since I was little. Like when I was outside and I would play in the mud, or I would like ride the four-wheeler into the trails in the forest. And I think I've been thinking about ecology and nature and conserving nature for a long time, and I think it took some of these introductory science classes to kind of know that that's like, oh, this is something like actually I'm really interested in, and this is like a part of my life I think that I've had for a long time. I just kind of didn't know that.
Yeah, kids are scientists.
Yeah, totally. Oh, totally. And I've always been a curious and creative person, I think, and I always thought science was so like this, you're in the lab and you wear a lab coat and it's cold and you're inside all the time. And that's not what science is for me at all. In fact, like last summer when I was doing my field work, I was outside 40 hours a week or more. I was able to be in my element and kind of like be in the natural spaces, and that is inspiring and motivating in itself, I think, a lot. And the value of nature the value that we place on nature in our society, I think, is so much lower than it should be. I think nature is so important to children and to people. But I'm so happy I get to like do that in my work. Like, how amazing, right?
So what is your favorite thing about doing field work?
I mean, I just love like getting out there in the prairie, especially like, when you have those big blooms like in late August. In Minnesota, at least, that's kind of like the big blooms. You have all the asters, and a lot of the asters are a family of plant also, by the way.
Yeah. they're sort of daisy-ish in their shape, but they're often like purple, right?
Yeah, like sunflowers sort of, but purple or white. And for me, just like being able to experience nature is such a great part of my fieldwork, and also like just being outside and doing hard work, physical hard work, I think for me is really motivating, because I feel really energized like moving my body. And I think too, like when I struggled with science when I was a kid, you're like sitting at a desk in a classroom, and maybe it's cold or hot or boring and there's no windows, and really like my science is like the complete opposite of that. I get to be creative, I get to be outside, in the warm weather and in the sunshine, and that's what science is for me now, and that's like a really great component of like why I do this.
Yeah, and it's hands-on instead of being in a book, which feels very sort of distant, right?
Yeah, there's like a kinesthetic, motion-oriented part of like science for me, and I think that is something I really value now. So.
Yeah, I hear you. I love field work. Yeah, and you said that you love and have been fascinated by bees for a long time. So like, what about working with bees is like the special thing for you?
Well, bees are a really important pollinator for a lot of native plants in North America, but also they're very important economically and used in agriculture as well. So what makes me interested in bees is that most bees are generalist pollinators, so they will collect pollen and nectar from lots of different plants, and so their value and importance is pretty they're a very important resource. And the sad thing is that we're seeing declines in bee species because of all of these different negative anthropogenic disturbances. And when I say anthropogenic, I mean human-caused or human-motivated disturbance that's often even beyond control of people sometimes, right? So we have these different things like loss of prairie land that might be converted to agriculture, or the use of pesticides in agriculture or in lawns, or chemicals like that. And so honestly, when I was in college, I was really into science journalism, and I would read a lot about it. And I remember this article, and I don't even know what news media it was in exactly, but it was about bee declines and why it's so important to protect and conserve pollinators. And also too, working with bees means you get to work with really pretty flowers, and you also get to work with really beautiful insect specimens too, because so many bees in my system too are these beautiful green metallic colors, or with stripes, or they're so cool and beautiful and intricate. And definitely for me, the aesthetic beauty of the work that I do is definitely a motivator for doing the work, right? I mean, it's kind of just it's so pleasant and nice to look at. Why wouldn't I want to learn more about this? So we kind of settled on bees, and I mean, I have a diversity of interests too beyond just bees and prairie plants, but for me, it felt what kind of questions and what kind of system can I work in where I feel I'm going to have the most impact, conservation impact, that can help people moving forward with their decision making on the land. And
I love that motivation. I feel very similarly. If our science can inform people who are trying to save the world, right? If we can help nature survive in some way through what we do, that feels really meaningful. That's awesome. So you are a master's student right now, right? Do you have 1 year left, or are you finishing up this semester?
Yeah, so I'm looking towards the end of this year to finish the program.
Nice. And this is always such a super trite question, but what do you see yourself doing, or what sort of goals do you have for yourself after your master's is finished?
Yeah, so I would love the opportunity. To bridge conservation and the things that I learned from my thesis with the public in some way. So I'm really interested in working, I don't know, with a nonprofit or state government on projects that can help inform and help educate people about different ways that we can help protect and conserve native bees, but also just more generally working with the public, helping kind of overcome some of the challenges that might come with conservation and the economic demands of people's livelihoods as well. So what kinds of things can you do maybe in your backyard? Maybe you love to garden. What are some things you can do to help pollinators or native plants or native animals that you can contribute your small part to? So something in that realm. I mean, I'd love to maybe one day pursue more education, but I think I feel a calling right now to work to help educate the public about the things that I've learned, because I feel the most, that to me feels the most personally rewarding, but also I think that education is a great way to bridge divides between people and their interests as well. So I think everyone, no matter what side of the political aisle you may be on or what your political leanings are, have a stake in conservation and in protection of our native ecosystems. And I think I'd love the opportunity to work with people to kind of help bridge that divide and help with education. So
we all live here.
And no matter what you might believe, politically, we all have a role to play.
So you mentioned, as part of your education interest, things that people can do in their own backyards to help native bees. So what would some of those things be?
So one of the first things that I would suggest you do is, if you have the opportunity and the space, I would encourage you to consider planting native plant species. So we know that bees really love the resources from a lot of the native plants that we find in Illinois and across the Midwest. And then another recommendation that I would give you would be to plant species that bloom throughout the whole growing season. So you really want things that are going to be available in early spring when some of the early emerging bees come out. And you will also want things that are going to go into the fall too, so that they have resources available throughout the whole seasonal variability. I'd also recommend, if you really like gardening, or if you have some natural space in your backyard, instead be a lazy gardener, or don't be so hard on yourself. So for instance, lots of bees like to nest underneath like dead plant material or kind of like in duff. A lot of people clear those things out from their gardens when they're getting ready. But you know what? If you can still have a really beautiful great garden, right? But leave a little bit of space for some of those like native plants and insects to continue to be able to build their nests in those areas. I'd also recommend as well, if you have patches of bare ground, so like I study ground nesting bees, they love bare soil, and they also love soil that's really easy to dig into. And so if you have some area that you can leave bare for bees, that would be one great way. But you can also find things like bee boxes, which are these wooden boxes that you can install on your houses for bees that build their nests in the wood. And I know people have sometimes issues with like carpenter bees building in their own homes, but if you can put some of these boxes out, you can maybe detract them away from like building in your own deck, or whatever. And then another big one that I would recommend is if you can, stop the use of pesticides and herbicides on your lawn. We really discount the impact that these chemicals can have on nature, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that insect declines and bee declines especially are driven by a lot of different things, like loss of where they can live and where they can get resources, but also because these chemicals, they're very sensitive to these chemicals. So I would recommend if you have the option between treating your lawn versus not treating your lawn, I would suggest don't treat your lawn. And then I would also consider consider electing politicians who hold these values close to them and who really value the environment. And so I mentioned a little bit that people on either side of the aisle can get behind conservation initiatives. And I believe, no matter who you are, clean drinking water is important to you and your family and your future. And also protecting and conserving these things that are valuable to our identity as an American. So, we have these great natural, beautiful native spaces, and our country is rich in resource diversity, and I think protecting that is an important part of holding our values close to us as people in this country. I think like people on both sides of the aisle really feel that way about nature in America.
We are the ones who established national parks and sort of set that conservation trend. So we should continue that.
And no matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you gain benefits from conservation. For sure. So I would encourage you to consider electing politicians who value nature and value conserving our native spaces. So I think there's this kind of perception, in ecology or about ecologists or people who study nature, that we have to kind of fit this like one sort of bill or like this one kind of like ideal. So, that you maybe like you need to wear chacos or like you need to like be vegan, or, if you're not going rock climbing and hiking and, traveling across the, Western U.S. all the time, that you're not like a real ecologist and you don't really value nature. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that like I'm a real ecologist and I study real plants and real insects, real animal species, and sometimes I just like don't like to go hiking, and and sometimes I just like don't want to be outside. I have other interests besides sustainability and this like whole ideal ecologist sort of type, and I think a lot of that plays into our what we think of what science should be too. And so science has been very historically male and white and Western, and I don't believe that science should be that way at all. And I think kind of part of like learning more about me as a scientist is that like I love being out in nature, but also I love just like being inside and reading a nice book. And I love like traveling and learning new things and learning new languages, and I'm not this like one-faceted person, and I have diverse interests besides what you might think an ecologist should be. And in fact, I would assume that most ecologists that you meet are actually like that too, and we don't all wear tacos, and we're not all. In fact, I have owned chacos, but like I never really wore them. So
you know what? I mean, you're wearing them right now, and I was wearing them yesterday. But there are a lot of people at this conference wearing chucks.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, maybe that's the only acceptable attire.
Really,
for
ecologists wear chucks.
No, but they're comfortable and practical, right? But I mean, I also want to say, like, if you're
No, you're fine.
if you're a scientist and those are ideals that belong to you, there's no harm or shame in that either as well. And I think the idea here is that ecology and science is such this multifaceted, diverse environment, and part of what we can do to make science more acceptable or more accessible, and part of what we can do to help make research better and help meet the public better is to help diversify and bring people in to science who have multifaceted, diverse backgrounds. And so that to me is like really important. So
Yeah. Yes, it is. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was awesome. I feel so many of the things that you've said today, and I really appreciate that you wanted to come talk to us about yourself and your research and your feelings on science. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and as always, her Twitter handle is down in the video description. So go follow her for plants and bees and things.
So I just want to give a thank you to all of the people who have helped contribute to this project, and especially like local landowners where I was able to do my research. Regular people are an important part of conservation. We often forget to acknowledge them and by regular people I mean people who are not scientists, and everyone can have a role to play in helping in conservation and science, no matter how much you know about science or not, right? I also want to thank my funding sources. So without these grants, I wouldn't have been able to do what I was able to do with my research. And then also thank like my family and friends and my advisor for like their support and guidance. I am very grateful to all of the people out there who help kind of like create this environment where scientists are able to thrive and learn more about the natural world and how we can protect and conserve bees. So also if you're interested in more things about ground nesting bees, like feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk more about my research if there's anything here that you didn't feel like was well explained or understood. So thank you.
If you liked this video, don't forget to like it. If you didn't like this video, please share it with someone who would. And if you'd like to support the Roving Naturalist, remember to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.